The red dust swirled around Sophie's ankles as she backed against the weathered fence post, her small heart hammering against her ribs. 6 men in tattered leather vests surrounded her in a tightening semicircle, their choppers parked haphazardly. On the desert trail behind them, the leader, a towering figure with a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, leaned down until his face was inches from hers, tobacco and whiskey tainting each word. "Well, ain't this interesting? Colonel Harper's granddaughter all alone in Painted Canyon." Sophie's 8-year-old frame trembled like a leaf in autumn wind, tears tracking clean lines down her dust-streaked cheeks. Miles from the nearest ranch, her cries would vanish into the vast New Mexico wilderness. Nobody would hear her desperate pleas, nobody except the ancient spirits that some said still roamed these forgotten canyons. The first warning came as a distant rumble, almost like summer thunder rolling across the mesas. Then silence fell, as if the desert itself held its breath. The bikers turned toward the sound, just as a magnificent wild mustang appeared atop the nearby ridge, its copper coat blazing like fire in the afternoon sun. The stallion's muscles rippled. Beneath its gleaming hide, as it stood statue-still, dark eyes fixed on the unfolding scene below. For one breathless moment, as the men reached for concealed weapons, and the Mustang's nostrils flared with unmistakable purpose, no one could have predicted the extraordinary chain of events that would forever bind their fates together. Colonel James Harper had never expected to raise a child in his retirement years. At 65, after 3 decades of military service and 2 combat tours that left invisible scars deeper than the shrapnel wounds on his left leg, he had purchased the struggling Double H ranch outside Cimarron Springs with dreams of quiet, solitude. The modest property, with its century-old adobe house and sweeping views of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, was meant to be his sanctuary. A place to finally outrun the nightmares that had followed him home from war. Then came the phone, call that shattered his carefully constructed peace. His only son David and daughter-in-law Maria, killed instantly when their small plane crashed in a sudden storm over the Colorado Rockies. Their 8-year-old daughter Sophie, the granddaughter James barely knew, suddenly orphaned. The decision to take her in wasn't really a decision at all. Harper had spent his life honoring duty and sacrifice. He wouldn't fail his family now, even if he had no idea how to comfort a grief-stricken child. Sophie arrived at the Double H 3 days after the funeral, clutching a worn stuffed horse named Cinnamon and speaking barely above a whisper. The colonel, as everyone in Cimarron Springs still called him out of respect, had prepared the small bedroom adjacent to his with fresh linens and a bookshelf filled with children's stories. But nothing in his military training had equipped him for the heavy silence that filled the old house, or the sound of muffled sobbing that drifted through the thin walls at night. "She needs time," Dr. Elaine Martinez had advised during one of Sophie's checkups at the local clinic. "Children are remarkably resilient, but grief follows its own timeline. Don't push, but don't walk on eggshells either. Structure and normalcy will help." So the colonel had created routines: breakfast at 0700 hours, school in town, afternoon chores, dinner precisely at 1800. He'd stood at Sophie's bedroom door each night, awkwardly wishing her sweet dreams while wondering if he should offer more. A hug, perhaps, or words of comfort his own gruff nature couldn't seem to formulate. Slowly, over the months, Sophie had begun to emerge from her shell. Her whispers grew into full sentences. She started helping with ranch chores without being asked, developed a fascination with the native wildflowers that dotted the property, and even smiled occasionally when Hector Mendoza, the colonel's ranch hand, taught her to collect eggs from the small chicken coop. The Double H was by no means a large operation, just a few dozen cattle, some chickens, and 2 aging quarter horses, but it provided enough work to keep the colonel occupied and, increasingly, enough distractions to help Sophie heal. It was the wild horses that finally sparked true joy in the child's eyes. The first time a small band of mustangs appeared in the distant pasture that bordered public land, Sophie had gasped in wonder. "Grandpa! Look!" she'd cried, the first time she'd called him anything other than Sir or Colonel. The 5 wild horses, led by a magnificent copper-colored stallion, had grazed cautiously at the edge of Double H property, free spirits temporarily sharing the boundary between wilderness and civilization. "Those are mustangs," the colonel had explained, unexpectedly moved by Sophie's excitement. "Wild horses that have never been tamed. This land used to belong to them before ranchers came." He'd hesitated, then added, "Your grandmother loved them too, said they represented everything beautiful about the American West, resilient, proud, and free." After that day, Sophie spent hours watching for the mustang herd, sketching them in a notebook the colonel had purchased in town, and reading every book about wild horses she could find in the small Cimarron Springs library. The copper stallion, whom she named Ember, seemed to visit more frequently than the others, sometimes appearing alone at dawn or dusk, watching the ranch house from a distance before disappearing back into the rugged landscape. "That one's keeping an eye on us," Hector had commented once, his weathered face creasing with a smile. "My people, the Jicarilla Apache, believe mustangs carry the spirits of warriors. Perhaps he's making sure the little one is healing." The colonel had dismissed such notions with a grunt, but secretly watched the interactions with curiosity. The stallion never approached closer than 100 yards, maintaining a wild animal's natural caution, yet seemed uncommonly interested in their activities. Sometimes, when Sophie sat reading on the front porch, the colonel would spot the copper mustang on a distant ridge, as still as a statue, seemingly watching over her. The town of Cimarron Springs had changed significantly since James Harper had purchased the Double H 5 years earlier. The small community had once been primarily ranching families, many descended from the original Spanish and Anglo settlers who had claimed the high desert valley generations ago. But economic pressures had forced many to sell parcels of land, and the area had slowly attracted a different element: weekend tourists seeking authentic Wild West experiences, retirees looking for affordable property with mountain views, and a growing transient population drawn to the region's isolation. Most concerning to the colonel was the increase in motorcycle traffic along the rural highways. The Desert Scorpions, an outlaw motorcycle club with chapters across the Southwest, had established a growing presence in the area, using the remote terrain and sparse law enforcement to conduct business away from prying eyes. Though they maintained a legitimate clubhouse in a converted gas station at the edge of town, rumors of drug trafficking, weapons deals, and worse circulated among the longtime residents. Sheriff Abigail Whitehorse, a former Army MP who had served under Harper in his final years at Fort Bliss, kept close tabs on their activities, but lacked the resources to mount a proper investigation. "They're careful, Colonel," she'd explained during one of her occasional visits to the Double H. "Nothing obvious enough to justify bringing in state police or the feds. just a steady increase in meth and fentanyl in the high schools, a rise in property crimes, and local business owners who suddenly don't want to talk about who's pressuring them for protection money. The colonel had offered to help, his old instincts for strategy and intelligence gathering still sharp, but Sheriff Whitehorse had gently refused. "You've served enough, sir. Focus on that little girl now. She needs you more than Cimarron Springs does." So he had tried, diligently maintaining the ranch, learning to cook more than military-style meals, attending parent-teacher conferences with awkward determination, and even allowing Sophie to decorate the austere living room with her increasingly accomplished horse drawings. They had settled into a functional, if somewhat formal, relationship until the arrival of Vince Rawlins threatened everything. Rawlins had appeared at the Double H Gate one unseasonably warm April afternoon, driving a luxury SUV with Texas plates and sporting an expensive suit that looked out of place in the dusty ranch yard. The colonel had been repairing fence posts when the vehicle pulled up, Sophie helping by holding nails and passing tools from a safe distance. "Colonel Harper," Rawlins had called, emerging from the air-conditioned comfort of his vehicle. "Vincent Rawlins, Frontier Development Group. Got a minute to talk business?" Something in the man's too wide smile had immediately set Harper on edge, but years of military discipline had taught him to assess before reacting. "Sophie, go help Hector with the chickens," he'd instructed before approaching the visitor. "I'm Harper. What's this about?" Rawlins had launched into a well-rehearsed pitch about property values, development potential, and generous offers for strategically located ranches with water rights. The colonel had listened stonily until Rawlins mentioned the Double H specifically. "Not interested," Harper had interrupted. "This land isn't for sale." Rawlins' smile had faltered momentarily. "Colonel, I don't think you understand what we're offering. The Double H is, well, let's be frank, it's barely solvent. Our initial offer would be 3 times its market value." "Still not interested," Harper had repeated, turning back toward his fence repair. "And I don't recall sharing my financial situation with you or your company, Mr. Rawlins." "We do our research," Rawlins had replied smoothly. "Look, I understand your attachment to the place, but you've got your granddaughter to think about now. This kind of money could secure her future, pay for college, set her up properly." He'd pulled out a business card, holding it toward Harper. "Why don't you think it over? Talk to your financial advisor." "I'm in town for the next week." The colonel had ignored the offered card. "My granddaughter's future is my concern, not yours. The Double H stays in the family. Good day, Mr. Rawlins." "You're making a mistake, Colonel," Rawlins had called as he retreated to his vehicle. "This offer won't be available indefinitely. Progress comes whether we want it or not." That evening, the colonel had contacted Sheriff Whitehorse to inquire about Frontier Development Group. Her findings had been troubling. The company had acquired several struggling ranches in neighboring counties over the past 2 years, often using aggressive tactics and leveraging financial distress. More concerning were the rumors of connections between Frontier's principals and organized crime in Arizona and Nevada. Nothing provable, but enough smoke to suggest fire. "Be careful, James," the sheriff had warned. "These corporate types play a different kind of hardball than we're used to. If they want your land badly enough, they might not stop at offers." The warning had proven prescient. Within days, the colonel's bank had suddenly discovered issues with his mortgage that needed immediate attention. The local feed store mysteriously lost his standing order for hay and supplements, A county inspector appeared without notice, citing potential code violations that had never been issues before. None of it was overtly threatening, just a steady pressure designed to make life at the Double H more difficult. Throughout these troubles, the colonel maintained his stoic demeanor, shielding Sophie from his growing concerns. The ranch had been struggling financially even before these new pressures. Drought had increased feed costs, and veterinary bills for the aging livestock had depleted much of his retirement savings. But the land represented more than an investment to James Harper. It was his final mission, his legacy for Sophie, and the promise he'd made to his late wife that someday their family would have roots that couldn't be severed by military reassignments. He would not surrender it without a fight. The annual Founders Day festival in Cimarron Springs Town Square had been a tradition for over a century, commemorating the town's establishment with food stalls, local crafts, music, and games for children. Despite his preference for solitude, the colonel had promised Sophie they would attend, recognizing her need for normalcy and social interaction beyond the isolated ranch. "Can we get cotton candy and see the barrel racing?" Sophie had asked. That morning, more animated than she'd been in weeks, her enthusiasm was impossible to deny, and the colonel had found himself smiling genuinely as they drove into town, Hector following behind in his own truck to meet his family at the festival. "We can do all of it," he'd promised. "It's your day, kiddo." The morning had passed pleasantly enough. Sophie had won a small stuffed horse at the ring toss, devoured a massive cotton candy, and applauded wildly during the exhibition rodeo events. The colonel had exchanged greetings with long-time residents, many of whom made a point of telling him how well Sophie was looking. A tacit acknowledgement of the progress since the hollow-eyed child had first arrived at the Double H. It was early afternoon when Harper spotted Vincent Rawlins across the town square, engaged in animated conversation with three men whose leather vests identified them as members of the Desert Scorpions. The colonel had observed discreetly, military instincts on high alert, as money visibly changed hands before the group dispersed. "Sophie, stay close," he'd instructed, suddenly wary. But when he turned, Sophie was no longer beside him. Scanning the crowded square, he caught a glimpse of her blue denim jacket disappearing around the corner of the community center, apparently following a group of children toward the petting zoo. The colonel had moved to follow, but was intercepted by Mayor Gutierrez, eager to discuss the upcoming water rights meeting. By the time Harper extricated himself from the conversation, Sophie was nowhere in sight. A quick check of the petting zoo, the face-painting station, and the food vendors yielded nothing. "Have you seen my granddaughter?" he asked increasingly urgently to festival-goers, showing a recent photo on his phone. 8 years old, blue jacket, brown hair in braids. It was Hector who finally provided a lead. "Colonel, a kid from the petting zoo said Sophie followed a puppy toward Painted Canyon Trail. She went with some man who said he knew where the dog lived." The colonel's blood ran cold. Painted Canyon was a remote hiking area that bordered both the Double H and public land. Rugged terrain where the wild mustangs were often spotted, but dangerously isolated and with spotty cell reception. "Call Sheriff Whitehorse," he instructed Hector sharply. "Tell her Sophie's missing, possibly lured away. I'm heading to the canyon now." "I'll come with you," Hector offered, but the colonel shook his head. "Stay here in case she returns. And keep an eye out for Rawlins and those bikers. I don't like the timing of this." The drive to Painted Canyon Trailhead had never seemed longer. the colonel's truck kicking up dust clouds as he pushed it to its limits on the unpaved access road. His military training kept his hands steady on the wheel, even as his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. The pistol secured in his ankle holster, a habit he'd never abandoned after retirement, provided small comfort against the growing knot of fear in his stomach. In 30 years of military service, including 2 wars and countless high-risk operations, Colonel James Harper had never known terror like this. The pure, primal fear for the safety of the small girl who had unexpectedly become the center of his world. As he skidded to a stop at the trailhead and grabbed his hiking stick and binoculars, a silent prayer formed on the lips of a man who hadn't prayed since his wife's funeral. Please, let me find her in time. What he couldn't know as he set off at a rapid pace along the rocky trail was that less than 2 miles ahead, Sophie already faced danger far beyond a lost puppy, and that salvation would come in a form neither military strategy nor modern weapons could have provided. Sophie had followed the scruffy black-and-white puppy without hesitation. The small dog had appeared as she exited the petting zoo, wagging its tail enthusiastically and carrying what looked like a child's stuffed toy in its mouth. When a friendly man in a denim jacket approached, explaining the puppy had escaped from his daughter's birthday party at the canyon picnic area, Sophie hadn't questioned the story. The thought of returning a lost pet to a waiting child seemed like the right thing to do. It's just down this trail a little ways, the man had assured her, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Your grandfather said it was fine. He's talking to the mayor about boring grown-up stuff. Only when they'd hiked nearly 2 miles into Painted Canyon, far from the festival crowds, did Sophie begin to worry. The puppy had disappeared around a bend, and the man's demeanor had shifted subtly, his smile thinning, his eyes constantly scanning the trail behind them. When she'd asked to turn back, suggesting they find her grandfather first, the man's response had been curt. Keep walking, kid. Almost there. They had rounded a final bend to find 5 motorcycles parked in a small clearing, their riders lounging against sun-warmed rocks. Sophie immediately recognized their leather vests emblazoned with the Desert Scorpion's insignia. Her grandfather had pointed them out in town before, always with a warning to stay clear. Ice-cold fear had replaced her confusion as the man from town called out to the waiting bikers. Got her, Razor. Harper's granddaughter, just like Roland said. The largest biker, his scarred face making him instantly recognizable as the group's leader, had smiled coldly as he approached. Nice work, Curtis. You actually earned your cut this time. Sophie had turned to run, but the man who'd lured her, Curtis, caught her arm easily. Where you going, sweetheart? We're just getting acquainted. Now, backed against the weathered fence post at the edge of the clearing, Sophie fought to control her trembling as the 6 men surrounded her. The puppy, she realized, had simply been a prop, likely trained to carry the toy and lead children away. The realization that she'd fallen for such a simple trick made her stomach clench with shame and fear. What do you want? She managed to ask, her voice smaller than she intended. The leader, Razor, crouched to her level, his leather vest creaking. It's not about you, kid. It's about your grandpa. The stubborn old colonel needs to learn that some offers you don't refuse. He'll find me, Sophie said with more confidence than she felt. He was a soldier. He'll come looking. Razor's laugh was a harsh bark. Counting on it, little lady. That's the whole point. He straightened up, addressing his companions. Vince, Wants this done clean. No harm to the kid, just enough to scare the old man into selling. Scorpions don't hurt children. We clear?" The men nodded, though Sophie noticed one, a younger biker with nervous eyes, looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Jesse, get on the radio. Tell Vince we're in position," Razor ordered. "Tank, Diesel, watch the North Trail. Curtis, keep an eye on the girl, and somebody find that damn dog before it wanders off again." As the men dispersed to their assigned tasks, Sophie desperately searched for any opportunity to escape. The clearing was surrounded by steep canyon walls on 3 sides, with the trail they'd followed providing the only obvious exit. Even if she could outrun Curtis, the other bikers would easily catch her before she reached the main path. Her racing thoughts were interrupted by that strange, distant rumble, like thunder, but somehow different. The bikers heard it too, their conversations halting as they turned toward the sound. Sophie felt it more than heard it, a rhythmic vibration through the rocky ground beneath her feet, growing steadily stronger. The sensation was oddly familiar, reminiscent of the trembling earth she'd felt when the wild mustangs had galloped past the ranch house one morning. When the copper stallion appeared atop the ridge overlooking the clearing, Sophie's heart leapt with recognition. Ember stood majestically against the brilliant blue sky, mane flowing in the canyon breeze, powerful muscles coiled beneath his gleaming coat. His head was high, nostrils flared, dark eyes fixed on the scene below with an intensity that seemed almost human. "What the hell?" Razor muttered, reaching instinctively toward the weapon concealed at his waist. "Where'd that come from?" For one frozen moment, the tableau held, 6 bikers staring upward, Sophie pressed against the fence post, and the magnificent Mustang silhouetted against the New Mexico sky. Then, with a shrill neigh that echoed through the canyon like a battle cry, Ember charged down the steep slope. No horse should have been able to navigate such treacherous terrain at speed, yet the Mustang moved with impossible grace, powerful legs finding purchase on the rocky incline as gravity and momentum propelled him toward the clearing. The sight was terrifying and beautiful, primal power unleashed, a force of nature descending upon them. "Get the guns!" Razor shouted, drawing his own pistol. "Shoot that crazy thing!" The bikers scrambled for weapons, but the Mustang was moving too fast. He hit the clearing floor at full gallop, dust billowing in his wake as he charged directly toward the group. Sophie pressed herself flat against the fence post, torn between terror and wonder as Ember thundered past her. Targeting the bikers with unerring precision, Razor managed to fire a single wild shot before the Mustang was upon him, rearing up on powerful hind legs, forelegs slashing the air dangerously close to the biker's face. Razor stumbled backward, his weapon flying from his hand as he fell. The other bikers scattered, their training and bravado evaporating in the face of nearly 1,000 pounds of enraged wild horse. In the chaos, Sophie saw her opening. With the bikers distracted by the rampaging Mustang, she slipped along the fence line toward the trail entrance. She'd nearly reached it when Curtis spotted her escape attempt. "The kid!" he shouted, lunging to intercept her. Sophie darted to the right, but knew she couldn't outrun the adult. Just as Curtis's fingers brushed her jacket, Ember somehow materialized between them, spinning with balletic precision to place his body between Sophie and her pursuer. The Mustang's teeth snapped, missing Curtis's arm by inches and sending him scrambling backward in panic. "Grandpa!" Sophie screamed, spotting a familiar figure at the trail entrance. Colonel Harper, hiking stick in hand, face a mask of cold fury as he took in the scene. "Sophie, get behind me!" the colonel commanded, advancing into the clearing with military precision, every movement controlled despite the rage evident in his eyes. His right hand moved toward his ankle, where Sophie knew he carried his service pistol. Razor, regaining his feet and recognizing the newcomer, raised his hands placatingly. "Easy, Colonel. This isn't what it looks like." 6 armed men surrounding my granddaughter miles from town. Harper's voice was arctic. "Looks exactly like kidnapping and potential assault to me." "Just a little business negotiation," Razor insisted, eyes darting between the colonel and the mustang, which stood protectively near Sophie, ears flattened against its head in warning. "Vince Rawlins sends his regards. Says to remind you his offer expires tomorrow." Understanding dawned on the colonel's weathered face. "Rawlins put you up to this, using my granddaughter as leverage?" Before Razor could respond, the clatter of hooves on stone announced new arrivals. 4 more wild mustangs crested the ridge, where Ember had first appeared, the rest of his band responding to some silent call. They descended the slope more cautiously than their leader had, but with the same impossible sure-footedness, forming a semicircle behind Ember and Sophie. The biker's bravado crumbled entirely at this new development. Even Razor seemed at a loss, confronted by 5 wild horses, an enraged military veteran, and the rapidly deteriorating control of a situation that was supposed to be a simple intimidation job. "This is over," Colonel Harper stated flatly, his hand still hovering near his concealed weapon. "You're going to leave now, all of you. And when Sheriff Whitehorse comes asking about attempted kidnapping charges, you might want to consider how quickly Rawlins will distance himself from this operation gone wrong." "You can't prove anything," Razor snarled, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. 5 wild horses appeared out of nowhere to rescue my granddaughter from armed bikers? The colonel's smile was humorless. "You're right. Who would believe such a story? Except everyone in Cimarron Springs knows about the Mustang herd that frequents the Double H, and my granddaughter's special connection to them is well documented." As if to emphasize his point, Ember moved to stand beside Sophie, his massive head lowered to her level. Hesitantly, the child reached out a trembling hand. The mustang, a wild animal that had never been touched by human hands, gently pressed his muzzle against her palm. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything known about wild mustang behavior, that even the colonel momentarily lost his composure. The bikers stared in disbelief, suddenly confronted with something that defied their understanding of the natural world. "What the hell kind of witchcraft?" one of them muttered. "It's not witchcraft," Sophie said, her voice steadier now as she stroked Ember's velvet nose. "He's my friend. He watches over me." The stillness of the moment was shattered by the distant wail of sirens. Sheriff Whitehorse and her deputies, responding to Hector's alert about Sophie's disappearance. Razor made a quick calculation, glancing at his scattered men, the approaching law enforcement, and the inexplicable presence of the wild horses. "We're out," he decided, gesturing sharply to his companions. "This job just got complicated." "Tell Rawlins I'll be paying him a visit," the colonel called as the bikers hurriedly mounted their motorcycles. "This wasn't business. This was personal. And now, so is my response." Razor's only answer was a spray of gravel as the motorcycles roared to life, carrying the desert scorpions back down the canyon trail, heading away from the approaching sirens. The colonel waited until they disappeared around the bend before rushing to Sophie, dropping to one knee despite the pain from his old injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, checking her for injuries with gentle hands that belied his fierce expression. I'm okay, Grandpa, Sophie assured him, throwing her arms around his neck. Ember saved me. He came just in time. The Colonel held her tightly, the terror of the past hour giving way to profound relief. Over Sophie's shoulder, he found himself looking directly into the dark, intelligent eyes of the copper mustang, standing just feet away. The wild horse returned his gaze steadily, an inexplicable understanding passing between man and animal. Yes, Harper acknowledged softly, he certainly did. Sheriff Whitehorse arrived minutes later, accompanied by 2 deputies and Hector Mendoza. They found the Colonel and Sophie sitting on a sun-warmed rock at the edge of the clearing, the wild mustangs grazing peacefully nearby, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The sheriff's expression as she took in the scene was one of professional skepticism battling with the evidence before her eyes. Wild horses simply didn't behave this way, yet here they were, comfortable in human presence, the copper stallion occasionally raising his head to check on Sophie before returning to his grazing. "You want to explain this, Colonel?" "Sheriff," Whitehorse asked as her deputies spread out to secure the scene. Harper recounted the events concisely, Sophie's abduction, the bikers' connection to Rawlins, and the timely intervention of the Mustangs. He deliberately omitted the most inexplicable aspects of Ember's behavior, knowing they would strain credibility even for someone as open-minded as Abigail Whitehorse. The sheriff's face darkened as she listened. "Rawlins is behind this." "You're certain?" "Razor confirmed it," Harper replied. "This was pressure to force the sale of the Double H." "Using a child." The disgust in Whitehorse's voice was palpable. "That crosses every line." "Can you arrest them?" Sophie asked hopefully. Sheriff Whitehorse crouched to the girl's level. "We'll certainly try, sweetheart. We'll take your statement and your grandfather's. But without physical evidence or witnesses beyond family members, they'll claim it was a misunderstanding." The Colonel finished grimly, "that Sophie wandered off, and they were trying to help her, and Rawlins will deny any knowledge of their actions." "Most likely," the sheriff agreed, "but that doesn't mean we do nothing. I've been building a file on the Desert Scorpions for months. This adds significant weight, especially with a child involved." She glanced at the Mustangs, which had moved slightly closer during their conversation. "And these horses, you said they just appeared?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Ember came first. He scared the bad men away from me. Then he brought his family to help." Sheriff Whitehorse looked to the Colonel for clarification. "Ember?" "The stallion," Harper explained. "Sophie named him months ago. He leads the small band that sometimes grazes near our property. And he just happened to be in the right place at the right time?" The sheriff's tone made clear her skepticism. "I've learned not to dismiss coincidences too quickly," the Colonel replied carefully, "especially out here." The conversation was interrupted by a deputy returning from the perimeter search. "Found this, Sheriff," he reported, holding up a scruffy black-and-white dog on a leash. Had a hidden compartment in its collar with small treats. Looks like it was trained to lead people somewhere. Sophie pointed at the dog. "That's the puppy I followed. The man, Curtis, he said it belonged to his daughter." Sheriff Whitehorse examined the animal with professional interest. "Clever. Kids are taught not to go with strangers, but following. A cute dog is irresistible." She handed the leash to her deputy. "Get photos, then check for a microchip. Might help us connect this back to our bikers." As law enforcement processed the scene, Sophie remained close to her grandfather, occasionally glancing toward Ember and his herd. The mustangs showed no inclination to leave, maintaining their position at the clearing's edge despite the increased human activity. "Why do you think they came, Grandpa?" Sophie asked quietly. "How did Ember know I needed help?" The colonel considered his answer carefully. His military career and pragmatic nature made him reluctant to embrace supernatural explanations. Yet what had happened here defied conventional understanding. "I don't know, Sophie. Maybe he recognized you from all those times you watched each other at the ranch. Wild animals are more perceptive than we give them credit for. Hector says the Apache believe mustangs carry warrior spirits," Sophie persisted. "Do you think Ember could have been a soldier once, like you?" The question touched something unexpected. In the colonel's heart, a memory of battlefield moments when instinct had saved him without rational explanation. Times when he'd felt guided by something beyond his training. He looked at the copper stallion thoughtfully. "Maybe not a soldier exactly," he said finally, "but a protector." "Yes, I could believe that." Sheriff Whitehorse approached, interrupting their conversation. "We're ready to take you both back to town. Medics want to check Sophie over, and I need formal statements." "The horses," Sophie began worriedly. "Will find their way home," the colonel assured her, rising stiffly from the rock. "Wild things always do." As they prepared to leave the clearing, Ember suddenly approached, moving with deliberate calm until he stood directly before the colonel. Man and horse regarded each other silently, a tension in the air that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with recognition. Without thinking, Harper raised his hand, not to touch, but as a gesture of acknowledgement between equals. The mustang held his ground, nostrils flaring slightly as he took in the human scent. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Ember lowered his head and gently, briefly pressed his muzzle against the colonel's outstretched palm. "I'll be damned," Sheriff Whitehorse whispered. The contact lasted only seconds before Ember retreated, rejoining his herd at the clearing's edge. But something profound had transpired. A covenant between protectors, a mutual recognition of shared purpose. As they hiked back toward the canyon entrance, Sophie's small hand firmly in his, the colonel found himself pondering the implications of what had transpired. The immediate danger had passed, but the conflict with Rawlins and the desert scorpions had only just begun. They would not take today's failure lightly, and the Double H remained vulnerable. Yet for the first time since learning of the threats against his property, Colonel Harper felt a curious sense of optimism. The land he had chosen for his retirement, for Sophie's new beginning, had revealed itself to be more than merely soil and grass and water rights. It was home to unexpected allies, wild and proud, but willing to stand against common enemies. The retired soldier in him recognized the strategic value of such alliance. The grandfather in him recognized something else entirely, the gift of witnessing his granddaughter's joy as she looked back one last time to see the copper mustang watching them from the ridgeline, silhouetted against the endless New Mexico sky. Back in town, the Founders' Day festival continued, though with subdued energy as news of Sophie's abduction and rescue spread through the community. Dr. Martinez examined Sophie at the small local clinic, finding her physically unharmed but emotionally exhausted. The colonel remained at her side. Throughout, his military bearing in full evidence despite his own fatigue. "She's remarkably resilient," Dr. Martinez commented as Sophie finally dozed off in the exam room. "But this was traumatic, James. She may have nightmares, anxiety about being separated from you. She'll need time and possibly counseling." "She'll have whatever she needs," the colonel replied simply. Sheriff Whitehorse joined them, her expression grim. "Just got word from my deputies. Rawlins checked out of his hotel an hour ago, left no forwarding information. The Desert Scorpions have gone to ground. Clubhouse locked up, no bikes in sight." "They're regrouping," Harper assessed. "Military, instincts kicking in. Tactical retreat to reassess after a failed operation." "Most likely," the sheriff agreed. "But this works in our favor legally. Fleeing the scene suggests consciousness of guilt. I've put out alerts to neighboring counties, and I'm preparing warrants for the bikers we can identify." "And Rawlins?" Sheriff Whitehorse's smile was cold. "I made some calls. Turns out the FBI office in Albuquerque has been interested in Frontier Development Group for months. Possible connections to organized crime, suspicious financing patterns. They're sending an agent to take statements tomorrow." The colonel nodded approval. "Good. But in the meantime, Sophie and I are vulnerable. At the Double H isolated minimal security. Stay in town tonight," the sheriff suggested. "The Rodriguez family has a guest house they'd be happy to offer." Harper shook his head. "Running isn't the answer. Besides, Sophie will recover better in familiar surroundings." He glanced at his sleeping granddaughter, her face finally peaceful after the day's terrors. "We'll go home, but we'll be ready if they come." What remained unspoken between them was the curious question of the mustangs, whether the wild horses would continue their inexplicable guardianship, or if their intervention had been a singular event never to be repeated. And deeper still lay the mystery of how such a connection had formed in the first place. As darkness fell over Cimarron Springs, these questions remained unanswered, a reminder that in the vast wilderness of the American Southwest, not all allies came in human form, and not all protection could be explained by conventional understanding. The drive back to the Double H Ranch that evening was fraught with tension. Sheriff Whitehorse had insisted on following the colonel's truck, her patrol car maintaining a vigilant presence behind them until they reached the property's perimeter. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat, her small frame wrapped in a blanket. Despite the warmth of the evening, fatigue and emotional aftermath visibly weighing on her shoulders. The colonel kept glancing in his rearview mirror, not just at the sheriff's escort, but scanning for any sign of motorcycles or Rawlins's distinctive SUV. "Will they come to the ranch, Grandpa?" Sophie finally asked, breaking the silence as they turned onto the long gravel drive leading to the adobe house. The colonel considered his answer carefully, balancing honesty with the need to avoid further frightening his granddaughter. "I don't think they'll try anything tonight. Sheriff Whitehorse has patrols watching the access roads, and Rawlins is too smart to make a move while law enforcement is paying close attention." "But later, when the sheriff isn't watching?" Harper tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his weathered knuckles whitening. "By then we'll be ready for them." As they pulled up to the house, Hector emerged from the barn, shotgun cradled in his arms, a sight that would have been alarming under normal circumstances, but now provided a measure of comfort. The ranch hand had been a competitive skeet shooter in his youth, and his presence added significantly to the property's defenses. "All quiet, Colonel," Hector reported as they exited the vehicle. "I checked the perimeter twice. No sign of visitors." Sheriff Whitehorse pulled up behind them, emerging from her patrol car with professional alertness, eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. "I've stationed Deputy Gonzalez at the main road junction," she informed Harper. "He'll be there all night. Anyone heading this way will be logged and questioned." "Thank you, Sheriff." the colonel acknowledged with a grateful nod. I still think you should consider alternative accommodations until we've contained this situation, Whitehorse pressed, lowering her voice so Sophie wouldn't overhear as the girl walked with Hector toward the house. The Rodriguez family's offer stands, or the safe house in Taos. Harper shook his head firmly. This is our home. Sophie needs stability, not another disruption. His expression softened slightly. Besides, running sends the wrong message. To Sophie and to Rawlins. The sheriff sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with the former military commander. At least tell me you'll keep that service weapon close at hand. Count on it, Harper assured her, and Hector will be staying in the guest room. He was Army Rangers before working ranch security in Texas. This won't be his first rodeo. Whitehorse nodded, somewhat mollified. I'll have a deputy drive by every 2 hours through the night. My direct line is programmed into your phone. Any suspicious activity you call immediately. After the sheriff departed, the colonel secured the house with military precision, checking locks, positioning furniture to create defensive barriers. If needed, ensuring clear sightlines to all approach routes. Hector mirrored his actions, the two veterans working in coordinated silence born of shared understanding. Sophie watched from the kitchen table, nursing the hot chocolate Hector had prepared, her eyes following their movements with solemn attention. Try to get some rest, kiddo, the colonel suggested gently when they'd finished. It's been a long day. Sophie nodded, but made no move toward her bedroom. Can I sleep in your room tonight, Grandpa? She asked hesitantly. The request squeezed. Something in Harper's chest, part pain at her fear, part fierce protection. Of course you can. As he helped Sophie prepare for bed, the colonel found himself reflecting on how drastically his life had changed since her arrival. The solitude he'd once craved now seemed hollow compared to the responsibility of guardianship. The threats against them had awakened something he'd thought long buried. The commander, the protector, the warrior who had once led men through the world's most dangerous territories. Those instincts hadn't diminished with retirement. They'd merely refocused on a single small person who now represented his entire world. Grandpa! Sophie's voice drifted from the bathroom where she was brushing her teeth. Do you think Ember will come back? The question caught Harper off guard. I imagine we'll see the Mustangs again. They've been visiting the ranch for months. No. I mean... Sophie emerged, pajama-clad and serious. Do you think he'll come if I need him again? Like today? The colonel hesitated, torn between practicality and the undeniable evidence of what they'd witnessed in Painted Canyon. I don't know, Sophie. What happened today was extraordinary, not something easily explained. Hector says some animals have guardian spirits, Sophie persisted, climbing into the colonel's bed and pulling the quilt to her chin. Maybe Ember is mine. Rather than dismissing the notion, Harper sat on the edge of the bed, considering her words with the seriousness they deserved. Hector's people have traditions and beliefs that go back thousands of years in this land, he said finally. I've learned not to discount their wisdom. Whatever Ember is, just a wild horse or something more, he certainly seemed determined to protect you today. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead. But remember, Sophie, we can't rely on wild animals to keep us safe. That's my job now. Sophie looked up at him, her young face suddenly older than her years. But who protects you, Grandpa? The question lingered in the darkness long after Sophie had fallen asleep. Harper sat in the armchair by the window, service pistol within, reach, watching the moonlit landscape beyond the glass. The property stretched away toward distant mesas, silvered by moonlight and shadow, beautiful, wild, and potentially harboring threats he could sense, but not yet see. Movement at the edge of his vision drew his attention to the eastern pasture. Harper leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed the distinctive silhouette of a horse standing motionless on the ridge, a lone sentinel beneath the star-filled sky. Then it was gone, leaving him wondering if exhaustion had conjured the image from his imagination and Sophie's questions. "Who protects you, Grandpa?" Perhaps, Harper reflected as he settled back into the chair for his vigil. That question had more than one answer. Morning arrived with the soft golden light characteristic of New Mexico. Dawns. The colonel, who had dozed fitfully throughout the night, rose stiffly from the chair and checked on Sophie. She slept peacefully, her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been since the previous day's ordeal. He left her to rest and made his way to the kitchen, where Hector was already brewing coffee. "Any activity?" Harper asked, voice low to avoid waking. "Sophie." Hector shook his head. "Quiet night. Deputy drove by at 0200 and 0400 as promised." He hesitated, then added, "But something interesting at first light. The Mustang herd is back, all 5 of them. They're in the north pasture." The colonel's eyebrows rose. "Including the copper stallion. Ember, as Sophie calls him." "Yes, but they're closer to the house than I've ever seen them. Almost like they're standing guard." Harper moved to the kitchen window, coffee forgotten. Sure enough, the small band of wild horses was clearly visible in the pasture, not grazing or moving as they typically would, but positioned in a loose formation facing outward, with Ember slightly ahead of the others. Their posture suggested alertness rather than relaxation, ears pricked forward, heads high as they surveyed the surroundings. "That's unusual," the colonel admitted, military mind automatically analyzing the tactical positioning. The Mustangs had placed themselves between the most vulnerable approach to the ranch and the house itself. A defensive perimeter no wild animal should have had the capacity to create. "Apache warriors believe that spirits sometimes take animal form to protect those who need them," Hector said quietly, joining Harper at the window. "Especially children." Before the colonel could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced a vehicle approaching. Both men tensed, moving instinctively toward their weapons until they recognized Sheriff Whitehorse's patrol car coming up the drive. More surprising was the black government SUV following close behind. "Looks like the FBI arrived earlier than expected," Harper commented, setting aside the shotgun he'd automatically retrieved. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, sleep-tousled and rubbing her eyes. "Someone's here?" "Just the sheriff," the colonel assured her, "and probably the FBI agent she mentioned. Nothing to worry about." The horses came back, Sophie observed, moving to the window with sudden animation. Ember brought his family again. "So, I see," Harper acknowledged, watching as his granddaughter's face lit up at the sight of the Mustangs. No matter what else happened, he reflected, the bond between Sophie and the copper stallion had provided a rare spark of joy in her grief-shadowed life. For that alone, he felt a debt to the wild creature that defied rational explanation. Sheriff, Whitehorse, and a tall woman in a crisp dark suit approached the house. Harper welcomed them on the porch, making introductions as Sophie and Hector remained inside. Special Agent Cassandra Reyes, the FBI agent identified herself, shaking Harper's hand firmly. "Sheriff Whitehorse briefed me on yesterday's incident. I'd like to hear your account directly, if that's possible." "Of course." The colonel gestured them inside, but Agent Reyes paused, her attention caught by the mustangs in the distance. "Wild horses?" she inquired, professional curiosity evident. "Part of a small herd that frequents the area," Harper explained, deliberately omitting the animal's extraordinary behavior. FBI agents generally preferred evidence to inexplicable phenomena. Inside, over coffee and Hector's homemade biscuits, Harper recounted the previous day's events, while Sophie remained curled in an armchair, occasionally nodding confirmation, but otherwise silent. Agent Reyes listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her professionalism was evident, but Harper detected genuine concern beneath her official demeanor, particularly when Sophie was mentioned. "Vincent Rawlins has been on our radar for some time," Agent Reyes confirmed when Harper finished. "Frontier Development Group has concerning financial patterns, investments from shell companies with ties to organized crime, primarily. We've suspected they're using real estate development to launder money, but proving it has been challenging. And now they've escalated to kidnapping," Sheriff Whitehorse added grimly. "Which gives us leverage," Reyes noted. "I've already spoken with the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're prepared to offer reduced charges to any Desert Scorpions members willing to testify against Rawlins." "You think they'll turn on him?" Harper asked skeptically. Agent Reyes smiled thinly. "Men like Rawlins inspire fear, not loyalty. The right pressure at the right point, and their organization crumbles." The conversation was interrupted by Sophie suddenly sitting upright, her attention fixed on the window. "They're coming," she announced with quiet certainty. All 4 adults turned toward the window, but saw nothing unusual. The mustangs, however, had changed position, grouped more tightly now, all facing the eastern approach to the property. "What's coming, Sophie?" the colonel asked, years of military experience having taught him to trust intuitive warnings. "Bad men," Sophie replied simply, her young face solemn. "Ember knows." Sheriff Whitehorse moved to the window, hand instinctively checking her service weapon. "I don't see any vehicles approaching." "Not yet," Sophie insisted. "But they're coming." Whether driven by the child's certainty or professional caution, Agent Reyes pulled a satellite phone from her jacket. "I'll have our surveillance team check the access roads." She stepped onto the porch to make the call, returning moments later, with confirmation that chilled the room. 3 motorcycles and a black SUV just turned onto the county road heading this way. Satellite imaging confirms the vehicle matches Rawlins' registered Escalade. Sheriff Whitehorse was immediately on her. "Radio calling for backup. ETA for my deputies is 15 minutes minimum," she reported, after receiving acknowledgement. "We're effectively on our own until then." The colonel's face settled into the hard lines of command he'd worn in combat zones across the world. "Hector, get the rifles from the gun safe. Sheriff, what's your assessment of likely approach vectors?" As the adults rapidly organized their defense, Sophie remained by the window, one hand pressed against the glass as she watched the mustangs. Ember had moved to the highest point of the pasture, his copper coat gleaming in the morning sun, head high and alert as he faced the direction from which danger approached. "They won't let the bad men hurt us," she murmured, more to herself than the others. Agent Reyes, overhearing as she checked her sidearm, gave Sophie a gentle look. "The wild horses? Sweetheart, they're beautiful animals, but they can't stop armed." "Men." Sophie turned, her expression holding a certainty that gave the FBI agent pause. "You didn't see what Ember did yesterday. He's not just a horse." Before Reyes could respond, the distant sound of motorcycle engines growled on the morning air. The colonel positioned himself at the front window, binoculars raised to scan the approach road. 3 bikes, as reported, he confirmed, and Rawlins' SUV behind them. Still about 2 miles out, Sheriff Whitehorse joined him at the window. Standard intimidation formation. They'll probably surround the house, try to force negotiations from a position of strength. Not if I can help it, Harper muttered. Hector, take position in the barn loft. You'll have elevation and cover there. Sheriff, can you secure the rear entrance? As they moved to implement the colonel's tactical plan, Agent Reyes appeared conflicted. I should note that FBI protocol recommends withdrawal and containment when civilians are at risk, not direct engagement. With all due respect, Agent Reyes, Harper replied. This is my home and my granddaughter. Withdrawal isn't an option. The standoff was interrupted by a sound that caused all of them to turn, a shrill, piercing neigh from outside, followed by the thunder of hooves. Sophie rushed back to the window, her face transformed by a smile of pure joy, despite the danger approaching. "Ember's calling the others," she exclaimed. "Look!" Beyond the pasture fence, dust clouds rose on the horizon. Not from the direction of the approaching motorcycles, but from the wild lands to the west. As they watched in astonishment, a dozen or more wild horses appeared, galloping at full speed toward the Double H. They poured over the ridge like a living wave, manes and tails streaming in the wind, moving with the coordinated purpose of a military unit responding to a call for reinforcements. "My God," Sheriff Whitehorse breathed. "Where did they all come from?" The newcomers joined Ember's small band, the combined herd now numbering nearly 20 strong. They arranged themselves along the property boundary, facing the approach road. Ember at their center, the morning sun gleaming on their varied coats, bay and dun, black and pinto, all wild and proud and somehow impossibly purposeful. This is that not normal wild horse behavior, Agent Reyes observed, professional composure momentarily cracking. "Welcome to the Double H," Hector murmured with quiet amusement, "where the normal rules don't always apply." The approaching motorcycles became visible on the long drive. 3 riders, followed by Rawlins' black SUV, dust billowing behind them as they barreled toward the ranch house with obvious intent. Their path would take them directly past the assembled mustangs, though the riders seemed oblivious to the unusual welcoming committee waiting for them. "Sophie, get away from the window," the colonel ordered, military training overriding his own fascination with the unfolding scene. "Everyone take defensive positions. They'll be here in minutes." But Sophie remained transfixed by the sight of the wild horses. "Wait," she pleaded. "Just watch." What happened next would later be described in official reports with careful, sanitized language that failed utterly to capture the raw, primeval power of the moment. As the motorcycles approached the final stretch of road before the ranch house, Ember suddenly reared up on his hind legs, forelegs pawing the air in a gesture as old as the relationship between humans and equines. A battle posture, a challenge. Then at some silent signal, the entire herd began to move as one entity, flowing over and through the pasture fence as if it didn't exist, directly into the path of the oncoming vehicles. The lead biker swerved dramatically to avoid collision, with the wall of horseflesh suddenly blocking the road, losing control and tumbling into the dirt as his motorcycle skidded away. The second rider managed to halt more successfully, but found himself surrounded by stamping, snorting mustangs that circled him with unmistakable menace. The third biker turned to flee, and was immediately pursued by several of the wild horses, driving him away from the property at full gallop. Rawlins's SUV screeched to a halt amid the chaos, its driver clearly unprepared for the bizarre obstacle before him. Inside the vehicle, visible through the windshield, Vincent Rawlins' face registered first confusion, then disbelief, and finally something approaching fear as Ember approached the driver's side door, massive head lowered, teeth bared in unmistakable threat. "Is this really happening?" Agent Reyes whispered, her training offering no protocol for wild animals, spontaneously intervening in a potential armed confrontation. "Should we do something?" Sheriff Whitehorse asked uncertainly, her hand still on her service weapon. The colonel slowly lowered his rifle, a strange calm settling over him as he watched the scene unfold. "I think it's being handled," he said quietly. Outside, the standoff continued for several tense minutes. Rawlins remained in his vehicle, apparently unwilling to test whether the Mustang's aggressive posture was bluff or promise. The fallen biker had regained his feet, but made no move toward his motorcycle, instead backing slowly away from the herd that had effectively cut off his approach to the ranch house. The second rider remained surrounded, his body language suggesting a man calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. Finally, Rawlins' SUV began to reverse, turning in a wide arc away from the property. The developer had apparently decided that whatever opportunity existed at the Double H wasn't worth the inexplicable intervention of nearly 20 wild horses. The bikers followed his lead, retrieving the fallen motorcycle and retreating down the access road with significantly less bravado than they had arrived. As the vehicles disappeared back the way they had come, Sophie clapped her hands in delight. "I knew it. I knew Ember would protect us." The adults exchanged glances that mixed relief with profound confusion. What they had witnessed defied explanation. Wild animals acting with apparent intelligence and coordination to defend human interests, responding to a threat they should have had no way of comprehending. "I'll need to document this in my report," Agent Reyes said finally, her voice faint, "though I'm not entirely sure how." Sheriff Whitehorse holstered her weapon with a bemused expression. "I've been in law enforcement for 20 years and never seen anything like it. Those horses moved like they were organized. The Apaches say," Hector began, "that spirits take animal form to protect those in need," the colonel finished, recalling their earlier conversation. "I know." He watched as the Mustang herd regrouped in the pasture, still alert but less aggressive now that the threat had retreated. Ember stood slightly apart from the others, his gaze seemingly fixed on the house where Sophie waved enthusiastically from the window. Outside, the sheriff's radio crackled with the announcement of approaching backup units. The immediate danger had passed, but questions remained that would not be easily answered in the aftermath. Questions about wild horses that behaved like guardian spirits, about a copper stallion that seemed to have appointed itself protector to a grieving child, and about the ancient, mysterious connections between humans and animals that modernity had all but forgotten. For Sophie, however, there appeared to be no confusion. As she beamed at the assembled Mustangs from the safety of the ranch house, her face reflected absolute certainty. "Ember remembered," she said simply. "Grandpa rescued him once, and now he's helping us." The colonel froze, a long-buried memory, suddenly surfacing with crystal clarity. 5 years ago, shortly after purchasing the Double H, he'd encountered poachers on the eastern boundary of his property. They had captured several young wild horses, including a copper-colored colt with distinctive white markings on its forehead. markings that match those now visible on Ember's mature face. Harper had confronted the poachers, driving them off and releasing the terrified young horses back into the wild. He had thought little of the incident afterward, just one small good deed in a lifetime of service. But now, watching the magnificent stallion standing guard over his property, the colonel wondered if some debts were paid in ways that transcended human understanding. "Is that true, Grandpa?" Sophie asked, noticing his expression. "Did you save Ember?" Harper nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "I think I might have when he was very young. I didn't make the connection until now." Agent Reyes, overhearing, gave him a questioning look. Harper briefly recounted the story of the poachers and the rescued colt. "So you're suggesting this wild stallion recognized you years later and decided to return the favor?" Her tone suggested professional skepticism, but her eyes held uncertainty. "That's quite a theory, Colonel." "I've learned that out here, Agent Reyes. Some things defy conventional explanation," Harper replied, watching as Sheriff Whitehorse coordinated with her arriving deputies outside. "What matters isn't how we explain it, but what we do with the second chance we've been given." The FBI agent studied him thoughtfully. "And what will you do with yours, Colonel?" Harper's gaze moved to Sophie, still captivated by the mustangs outside, then back to the federal agent. "First, I'm going to make sure Rawlins and his associates face justice for what they tried to do to my granddaughter. Then I'm going to secure this land, not just for Sophie and me, but for them as well." He nodded toward the wild horses. "They've earned a safe haven here, whatever they are." As law enforcement secured the property and began processing the scene of the confrontation, Sophie slipped her small hand into her grandfather's. "Can we go thank Ember?" she asked hopefully. "I think he'd like that." The colonel hesitated, military caution warring with the undeniable evidence of the mustangs' extraordinary behavior. "Wild horses are still wild, Sophie. It might not be safe to approach them directly." "He won't hurt us," Sophie insisted with absolute certainty. "He's family now. Family." The word resonated through Harper's chest, expanding to encompass not just his granddaughter, but somehow the magnificent wild creatures that had inexplicably come to their aid. Perhaps that was the truth at the heart of the mystery, that bonds of loyalty and protection could form across species, across time, connecting all who shared this ancient landscape. "All right," he agreed finally, "but we go slowly and we stop if they show any sign of nervousness." Together they stepped onto the porch and then down into the yard, moving deliberately toward the pasture where the mustang herd still maintained their vigilant presence. Sheriff Whitehorse watched with professional concern, but made no move to stop them, seemingly as curious as everyone else about the extraordinary connection between the child and the wild horses. As they approached the fence line, several of the mustangs shifted nervously, but Ember moved forward to meet them, his pace measured, head high. He stopped several yards away, regarding them with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold knowledge no wild animal should possess. "Thank you," Sophie said simply, addressing the stallion directly. "You saved me again." To the astonishment of everyone watching, Ember lowered his proud head in what appeared remarkably like acknowledgement. Then, with deliberate grace, he stepped closer to the fence, close enough that Sophie, reaching through the rails, could gently touch his velvet muzzle. The contact lasted only moments before the stallion backed away, rejoining his herd with a soft nickering sound that sent them all trotting toward the distant hills. But in that brief connection between child and wild horse, witnessed by hardened law enforcement officers and a skeptical FBI agent, something ancient and powerful had been affirmed, a covenant of protection, a bond that transcended the boundaries, humans so carefully constructed between themselves and the natural world. As the mustangs disappeared over the ridge, returning to the wilderness that was their true home, Colonel Harper placed his hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I think we've found our answer," he said quietly. "To what?" Sophie asked, looking up at him with curious eyes. The colonel smiled, remembering her question from the previous night. "To who protects us, kiddo? Turns out we have more allies than we knew." The next morning brought a flurry of activity to the Double H Ranch. Sheriff Whitehorse arrived early with Agent Reyes, both women, looking as though they'd spent the night reviewing evidence rather than sleeping. They were followed shortly by two unmarked government vehicles, carrying technical specialists who immediately began documenting tire tracks, taking soil samples from where the motorcycles had turned around and photographing the pasture where the Mustang herd had made their extraordinary stand. "Rawlins is gone," Agent Reyes announced, without preamble as she accepted the coffee the colonel offered on the porch. "Checked out of his hotel at dawn. Credit card shows a plane ticket purchase to Phoenix. Our field office there is tracking his movements." "And the Desert Scorpions?" Harper asked, watching as Sophie fed carrots to the ranch's two-aged quarter. "Horses in the nearby corral. Hector keeping watchful guard nearby." "Two were picked up trying to leave town," Sheriff Whitehorse replied with evident satisfaction. "Jesse Moran and Curtis Denton, the one who lured Sophie with the dog. Both already talking, hoping to cut deals." "What about their leader? Razor? Agent?" Reyes's expression tightened. "Still at large, but we've issued alerts to law enforcement across 3 states. He won't get far." She hesitated, then added, "We found some interesting connections when we raided the Scorpions clubhouse. Financial records linking their operations directly to shell companies owned by Frontier Development." "Money laundering?" the colonel guessed. "Military intelligence training kicking in." Among other things, turns out Rawlins was using the bikers to intimidate other property owners besides you. 3 ranches sold to Frontier in the past year after their owners experienced unfortunate accidents or vandalism. The Desert Scorpions were Rawlins' muscle, clearing obstacles for his land acquisitions. The colonel's gaze drifted to Sophie, now giggling as one of the horses gently nuzzled her palm for more treats. "And my granddaughter became just another obstacle to be cleared, which is why the federal charges against Rawlins will include conspiracy to commit kidnapping," Agent Reyes assured him. "That alone carries 20 years. With the financial crimes we're uncovering, he'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison." "Good," Harper said simply. Then, after a moment's consideration, "What about your report on yesterday's incident with the Mustangs?" Sheriff Whitehorse and Agent Reyes exchanged uncomfortable glances. "That's a bit more complicated," the sheriff admitted. "I've been in law enforcement 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what those horses did. My official report states that the suspects were deterred by the unexpected presence of a large number of wild horses that happened to be in the vicinity," Agent Reyes said carefully, "which is factually accurate while avoiding the more inexplicable aspects of their behavior." "You mean the fact that they appeared to deliberately intervene to protect us?" Harper pressed, a hint of amusement in his voice despite the serious topic. that they seemed to understand exactly what was happening and responded with organized defense tactics. Agent Reyes shifted uncomfortably. Colonel, I deal in evidence, provable facts. What I witnessed doesn't fit into those categories. And yet you saw it, Harper pointed out. We all did. Yes. Reyes glanced toward Sophie, her professional facade softening slightly. Your granddaughter seems to have a remarkable connection with these animals, particularly the stallion. In another era, she might have been considered blessed, Hector suggested, joining them on the porch. Touched by spirits? These are not new concepts to my people, just forgotten by yours. Rather than dismissing the ranch hand's words, Agent Reyes nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be solved through conventional investigation. Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a battered truck bearing the logo of the Bureau of Land Management. A tall, rangy woman in a BLM uniform emerged, her weathered face suggesting years spent in the harsh southwestern sun. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, she introduced herself, shaking hands firmly with everyone on the porch. Regional wildlife biologist with BLM. Sheriff Whitehorse called about your mustang situation. That's one way of putting it, the sheriff replied with a wry smile. Wait until you hear the details. Inside, over fresh coffee and Hector's homemade tortillas, Dr. Blackwood listened with increasing fascination as they recounted the events of the past 2 days. Her initial professional skepticism gradually transformed into intense curiosity. You're describing coordinated protective behavior, she said when they finished. That's extremely unusual for feral horses, especially toward humans they haven't been socialized with. These aren't just any mustangs, Sophie piped up from her seat at the table, where she'd been quietly drawing the copper stallion in her sketchbook. Ember is special. Dr. Blackwood smiled kindly at the child. Ember is the stallion, yes? The one that seems most connected to you? When Sophie nodded, the biologist continued, Has he ever let you touch him before yesterday? Not really, Sophie admitted. He used to watch me from the ridge when I read on the porch. Sometimes he'd come closer if I was quiet, but he always stayed on the other side of the fence. Until yesterday in the canyon. And you believe he recognized that you were in danger? Dr. Blackwood asked, her tone careful to avoid sounding dismissive. I know he did, Sophie replied with absolute certainty. And Grandpa saved him once, so he was paying back. The colonel briefly explained his encounter with horse poachers years earlier and how he suspected Ember had been among the young horses he'd rescued. Dr. Blackwood leaned back, considering this new information. Long-term memory in equines is well documented. Studies have shown they can remember specific humans and experiences for many years. And there are anecdotal reports of wild horses displaying protective behavior toward humans who have helped. In them, she paused, but organizing what amounts to a tactical defense against armed men, that's unprecedented. Yet we all witnessed it, Agent Reyes pointed out. Multiple law enforcement officers, myself included. I'd like to observe this herd, if possible, Dr. Blackwood decided. The behavior you're describing could represent a significant advancement in our understanding of feral horse cognition. With your permission, Colonel, I'd like to set up some monitoring equipment along the property boundary. For what purpose? Harper asked, military caution evident in his tone. Non-invasive observation, the biologist assured him. Motion activated. Cameras primarily. I want to document their natural behavior, particularly their interactions with Sophie, if any occur. The colonel glanced at his granddaughter, who was watching the conversation with intense interest. "Sophie, what do you think? It's your connection with Ember we're talking about." The child considered the question with surprising seriousness. "Will it help protect the Mustangs, Ember and his family?" Dr. Blackwood nodded. "It could. Wild horse populations face significant challenges in the Southwest. Habitat loss, illegal hunting, controversial BLM roundups, documentation of high-level cognitive abilities and positive human interactions. It could influence management policies." "Then it's okay," Sophie decided. "But you can't try to catch them or put tags on them." "Ember wouldn't like that. Observation only," Dr. Blackwood promised. "My interest is in understanding, not interfering." As arrangements were made for the monitoring equipment, Sophie slipped outside to the porch, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. The colonel watched through the window as she settled into the old rocking chair, searching the distant ridgeline with hopeful eyes. He knew she was looking for Ember, though the Mustang herd hadn't returned since their dramatic intervention the previous day. "She's quite remarkable," Sheriff Whitehorse commented, joining Harper at the window. "Most children would be traumatized after what she experienced, but she seems centered. Sophie's been through more loss in her 8 years than many adults face in a lifetime," the colonel replied quietly. "When her parents died, I thought I was taking in a broken child. Now I wonder if she's actually the strong one, teaching this old soldier about resilience." Outside, Sophie suddenly sat up straighter, pointing excitedly toward the eastern ridge. Everyone moved to the window to follow her gaze. There, silhouetted against the morning sky, stood a single horse, copper, coat gleaming in the sunlight, proud head held high as it surveyed the ranch below. "Ember," Dr. Blackwood breathed, professional composure momentarily forgotten. "Magnificent specimen." The Mustang remained on the ridge for several minutes, seemingly aware of the humans watching from the house. Then, with a shake of his flowing mane, he turned and disappeared over the ridge, heading back into the wild lands that were his true domain. "He's checking on her," Hector observed, "making sure she's safe." Neither the scientist nor the federal agent contradicted him. 3 days later, the Double H Ranch had settled into a new routine. Agent Reyes had returned to Albuquerque to coordinate the federal case against Rawlins and the Desert Scorpions. Sheriff Whitehorse maintained regular patrols past the property, though the immediate threat seemed to have passed. Dr. Blackwood had installed her observation equipment and established a small research camp on the eastern edge of the colonel's land, where she spent long hours documenting the Mustang herd's movements. Razor, the Scorpion's leader, had been apprehended attempting to cross into Mexico, adding flight to avoid prosecution to his growing list of charges. The Broken Motorcycle Gang was providing prosecutors with detailed information about Rawlins' operation, each member racing to secure the best possible deal. Frontier Development Group's assets had been frozen pending investigation, effectively halting their land acquisition activities throughout the Southwest. For Sophie, however, these developments held less interest than a more personal project. Each morning and evening, she would carry a small bucket of apple slices and carrots to the pasture fence, leaving the treats on a flat rock before retreating to the porch to watch and wait. The colonel, observing her patient ritual, said nothing. To discourage her, though he privately doubted wild mustangs would risk approaching so close to human habitation for mere treats. On the fourth morning, his skepticism was proven wrong. "Grandpa! Grandpa! Come quick!" Sophie's excited voice pulled Harper from his morning coffee and newspaper. He hurried outside, instinctively checking for his sidearm before registering the joy rather than fear in her tone. From the porch, he saw what had prompted her excitement. Ember stood at the pasture fence, calmly eating apple slices from the flat rock, while 3 other mustangs from his herd grazed cautiously nearby. The copper stallion raised his head at Harper's appearance, dark eyes assessing the human with that uncanny intelligence that still sent shivers down the colonel's spine. "Don't move too quickly," Harper cautioned Sophie as she bounced on her toes beside him. "We don't want to startle them." "He's not scared," Sophie said confidently. "He's just saying good morning." As if to prove her point, Ember nickered softly, then returned to the remaining treats. The domesticated quarter horses in the adjacent corral watched with evident interest, occasionally whinnying as if in conversation with their wild cousins. Dr. Blackwood's monitoring equipment had undoubtedly captured the extraordinary interaction, but Harper found himself glad the biologist wasn't present to turn this moment into a scientific observation. Some things, he was beginning to believe, were meant to be experienced rather than studied. Connections that transcended conventional understanding, bonds formed through shared danger and mutual protection. The morning ritual continued in the days that followed, with Ember and varying numbers of his herd appearing at dawn to accept Sophie's offerings. Each visit lasted slightly longer than the previous one, the mustangs gradually relaxing in the human presence, though they remained alert and would retreat at any sudden movement or noise. On the 10th morning, Sophie approached the colonel with a request that gave him pause. "Grandpa, can I sit by the fence while Ember eats? Not right next to it," she hastened to add, seeing his expression. "Just close enough that he knows I'm there." "Dr. Eleanor says wild horses need to build trust slowly." Harper considered the request carefully. He had come to accept the unique connection between his granddaughter and the copper stallion, but paternal caution remained. "Has Dr. Blackwood approved this?" Sophie nodded eagerly. "She said it's the next logical step in habituation. That's the word she used. It means getting them used to people, but not taming them. Ember will always be wild." "As he should be," the colonel agreed. "All right, but I'll be with you, and at the first sign of nervousness from the horses, we back away." "Immediately, understood?" "Yes, sir," Sophie replied with military crispness that made Harper smile despite himself. That morning they placed the treats on the rock as usual, then retreated to a small bench Harper had positioned about 15 feet from the fence, close enough to observe, but far enough to give the mustangs space. They waited in companionable silence, Sophie occasionally whispering explanations of Dr. Blackwood's research. "She says Ember is showing pro-social behavior that's statistically anomalous for feral equines," Sophie reported, carefully enunciating the scientific terminology. "That means he's friendly in ways wild horses usually aren't." "Dr. Blackwood seems to be teaching you a lot," Harper observed. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "She says I have good observation skills, and she doesn't think I'm making things up about Ember, even though she has to be scientific in her reports." Before the colonel could respond, movement on the ridge caught their attention. Ember appeared, leading not just 3 or 4 companions, as in previous days, but the entire herd, nearly 20 strong. They descended toward the ranch with their usual grace, spreading out as they approached the pasture fence. "He brought everyone today," Sophie whispered, excitement vibrating through her small frame. The copper stallion approached the rock with his customary alertness, but today, instead of immediately taking the treats, he raised his head and looked directly at Sophie and the colonel on their bench. His gaze held theirs for a long moment, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring slightly as he scented the air. "He's deciding," Sophie murmured, "checking if it's safe for his family." After what seemed an eternity, Ember lowered his head and delicately took an apple slice from the rock. This apparent approval signal prompted other members of the herd to approach, each taking turns at the offerings while maintaining watchful awareness of the humans nearby. "They're beautiful," the colonel said softly, genuine awe in his voice as he watched the wild horses, symbols of the freedom and resilience that had defined the American West long before humans claimed this harsh, magnificent landscape. "Dr. Eleanor says they're a special herd," Sophie informed him. "Most Mustang herds in this area have lots of different bloodlines mixed in, but Ember's family shows signs of Spanish colonial heritage, horses that escaped from the first explorers hundreds of years ago. That's why they're smarter and more connected to humans." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Is that Dr. Blackwood's scientific assessment?" Sophie giggled. "Not the smart part. She says we can't measure horse intelligence accurately. But she did say they're probably descended from Spanish horses because of their conformation. That means body shape, and their coloring patterns." The morning sun had fully crested the eastern mountains now, bathing the scene in golden light that transformed the Mustang's coats into a painter's palette of copper and bay, dun and chestnut. As the treats disappeared, most of the herd drifted toward better grazing. But Ember remained at the fence, studying Sophie with those unfathomable dark eyes. Slowly, with deliberate care, Sophie stood from the bench. "Can I go a little closer, Grandpa? Just a few steps." Every protective instinct in Harper urged caution, but something deeper, perhaps the same intuition that had kept him alive through 2 wars, told him this moment was important. "3 steps only," he agreed. "I'll be right behind you." Sophie moved with remarkable poise for an 8-year-old, each step measured and calm, her eyes never leaving Ember's. The stallion watched her approach, ears flicking forward, but showing no signs of anxiety. When she stopped at the agreed distance, still several feet from the fence, man and child and wild horse formed a triangle of silent communication. "Hello, Ember," Sophie said softly. "Thank you for saving me." The Mustang's response defied explanation. He stepped forward to the fence, stretched his neck across the top rail, and gently blew a soft breath toward Sophie, the equine greeting usually reserved for trusted herd members. Dr. Blackwood, who had approached silently during this exchange, gasped audibly. "I've never seen a truly wild Mustang initiate contact like that," she whispered to the colonel. "It's extraordinary." "Welcome to the Double H," Harper replied with the same words Hector had used days earlier. "We're the normal. Rules don't always apply." The biologist shook her head in wonder. "I've been reviewing the footage from yesterday. 3 coyotes approached the north pasture where your cattle graze. The Mustang herd intercepted and drove them off well away from your property line." She turned to Harper. Professional objectivity, warring with evident amazement. "They're patrolling your boundaries, Colonel. I've documented them making regular circuits of your property perimeter, always in groups of 2 or 3, always alert. Its behavior more reminiscent of guard dogs than wild horses. Protecting their territory," Harper suggested. "That would be the conventional explanation, but..." Dr. Blackwood hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Wild horses defend grazing areas and water sources, certainly, but they don't typically extend that protection to include human dwellings and domesticated animals. She nodded toward Sophie, who remained in silent communion with Ember. And they absolutely don't form bonds with human children, no matter how gentle the approach. What's happening here is something science doesn't have a framework to explain. The Colonel watched as Ember finally stepped back from the fence, gave one last look at Sophie, then turned to rejoin his herd with dignified grace. Perhaps some things aren't meant to be framed by science, Doctor. Perhaps, Dr. Blackwood conceded. She pulled a large envelope from her jacket and handed it to Harper. Which brings me to the other reason for my visit this morning. These are land survey maps from the BLM database. The red outlines show the boundaries of your property. The Colonel opened the envelope, examining the detailed topographical maps with a soldier's eye for terrain. What am I looking for? The blue shaded region to the east of your property line. That's 3,000 acres of federally managed land, currently designated for potential resource development. She paused significantly. It's also the primary range of Ember's herd, based on my tracking data. Understanding dawned. Resource development. You mean mining, drilling? Dr. Blackwood nodded grimly. There's been interest in mineral exploration. Nothing imminent, but the permits are working through the system. If approved, it would displace this mustang herd entirely, perhaps necessitate a roundup and relocation. The thought sent an unexpected pang through Harper's chest. After all that had happened, the idea of Ember and his herd being captured and removed from the land they had guarded so fiercely seemed profoundly wrong. "Is there an alternative?" he asked, military mind already strategizing. "Actually, yes." Dr. Blackwood pointed to notation on the map. This land could be redesignated as a wild horse sanctuary under private-public partnership. A landowner adjacent to the federal parcel, you, in this case, would agree to certain conservation easements on their own property in exchange for the BLM setting aside the adjacent land specifically for mustang preservation. You're suggesting I enter into a formal agreement to protect Ember's herd. I'm suggesting, Dr. Blackwood said carefully, that this remarkable relationship between your granddaughter and these wild horses might be worth preserving, not just for Sophie's benefit or even for the mustangs, but for what it might teach us about connections we've forgotten how to honor. The Colonel looked toward Sophie, who was walking back to them with a contentment in her young face he hadn't seen since before her parents' death. What would this partnership require from me? Primarily maintaining wildlife corridors through your property, preserving natural water sources, and allowing limited research access. Dr. Blackwood smiled. Things you're already doing, essentially. And, in return, the BLM creates the Painted Canyon Wild Horse Sanctuary with protected status that prevents development in perpetuity. The herd remains wild but protected with minimal human intervention. Harper folded the maps thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the mustangs now grazing peacefully in the distance, copper-colored stallion still keeping watchful eye on the humans near the fence. I think we've already entered into an agreement of sorts, he said finally. They protect what matters to us. We protect what matters to them. He extended his hand to the biologist. Draw up the paperwork, Doctor. The double H will do its part. As morning sunlight flooded the New Mexico highlands, illuminating ranch house and wild mustangs alike, Colonel James Harper reflected on the strange path that had led him here, from battlefield commander to reluctant guardian, from solitary widower to grandfather, from skeptic to believer in connections that transcended conventional understanding. Sophie rejoined him, slipping her small hand into his, with the easy confidence of a child who knows she is protected, not just by her grandfather's strength, but by something wilder and more ancient that had recognized in her a kindred spirit worth defending. "Ember says they'll stay close now," she announced matter-of-factly. "Not all the time, because they're still wild, but close enough to help if we need them." The colonel raised an eyebrow. "He told you that, did he?" Sophie nodded with absolute certainty. "Not with words, but I understood anyway." Looking out across the harsh, beautiful landscape that had become their home, Harper found he couldn't doubt her. Some communications required no words, only open hearts willing to bridge the distances humans had created between themselves and the natural world. In the distance, Ember raised his proud head, copper coat gleaming like living flame in the morning light. Wild and free, yet bound by invisible threads of loyalty to the child and the land he had chosen to protect. Sentinel of the high desert, guardian spirit from another time, reminder that in this ancient landscape, alliances might form in the most unexpected ways, offering protection when it was needed most. 6 months passed, transforming the high desert landscape around the Double H Ranch. Summer's relentless heat gave way to autumn's golden hues, which in turn surrendered to winter's crystalline beauty. Now with spring unfurling across the mesas and canyons, new life emerged from soil long dormant. Wildflowers painted the normally austere terrain with splashes of color. Indigo lupines, scarlet paintbrush, golden poppies, while the cottonwoods along creek beds unfurled fresh leaves that whispered in the warming breeze. The Double H itself had undergone transformations no less remarkable than the surrounding landscape. What had once been Colonel Harper's solitary refuge, then a makeshift home for an orphaned child, had evolved into something neither could have anticipated that fateful day in Painted Canyon. The most visible change was the new sign at the entrance. To the property, Double H Ranch and Painted Canyon Wild Horse Sanctuary. The weathered wood plaque, hand-carved by Hector, marked the successful implementation of the partnership Dr. Blackwood had proposed. 3,000 acres of federal land adjoining the colonel's property had been officially designated as protected habitat for Ember's herd, with the Double H serving as steward and gateway to the sanctuary. Less visible but equally significant were the changes to the ranch house itself. The previously Spartan interior now bore evidence of the young girl who called it home. Sophie's artwork adorning the walls, colorful throws brightening the aged furniture, and bookshelves overflowing with horse-related literature. The colonel's military mementos remained, but they shared space now with Sophie's ribbons from the local school's science fair, where her presentation on wild horse behavior had taken first prize. "Grandpa, they're here!" Sophie's excited voice carried from the front porch, where she had been reading while waiting for the weekly visit. At 9 years old now, she had grown taller and more confident, her earlier grief transformed into a serene maturity that sometimes startled adults meeting her for the first time. Colonel Harper emerged from his small office, moving with the careful gait of a man who had learned to manage old injuries without being limited by them. Through the window, he could see Dr. Blackwood's BLM truck coming up the drive, followed by a van from the University of New Mexico's Equine Behavior Research Program. Behind these familiar vehicles was a new addition, a sleek government sedan with federal plates. "Looks like we have an unexpected visitor," Harper observed, joining Sophie on the porch. "Did Dr. Blackwood mention anyone from Washington joining today's observation?" Sophie shook her head, copper highlights in her brown hair catching the morning sunlight. No, but Agent Reyes called yesterday while you were in town. She said someone important wanted to see the sanctuary. The colonel raised an eyebrow. And you didn't mention this because... Sophie shrugged with the casual innocence only children can truly master. I forgot. I was excited because Ember brought the new foals close enough for me to see them yesterday. Harper suppressed a smile. In Sophie's world, wild mustang foals would naturally take precedence over federal officials. He couldn't entirely disagree. With her priorities, Dr. Blackwood emerged from her truck, her normally practical field attire replaced by what appeared to be her version of formal wear. Pressed khakis and a crisp BLM shirt with official patches. The university researchers followed, similarly upgraded from their usual casual appearance. From the government sedan stepped a distinguished woman in her 60s, silver hair framing a face that managed to appear both grandmotherly and formidable. "Colonel Harper," Dr. Blackwood called, approaching the porch with uncharacteristic formality. "May I introduce Dr. Margaret Whelan, Undersecretary for Land and Wildlife Management at the Department of the Interior. Dr. Whelan, this is Colonel James Harper and his granddaughter Sophie." The colonel extended his hand. "Welcome to the Double H, Madam Undersecretary. This is an unexpected honor." Dr. Whelan's handshake was firm, her assessment of him equally direct. "Colonel Harper, I've heard quite a lot about you and your granddaughter from Agent Reyes and Dr. Blackwood." Her gaze shifted to Sophie. "And you must be the young lady who's been communicating with wild mustangs." Sophie straightened under the official's attention. "Yes, ma'am, mostly with Ember. He's the lead stallion. The others are still getting used to people." "So I understand." Dr. Whelan's expression softened slightly. "Your work with Dr. Blackwood has generated quite a buzz in certain circles at Interior. That's partly why I'm here today." Harper gestured toward the house. "Please come inside. Hector has prepared refreshments, and we can discuss whatever brings you all this way." Inside, the visitors settled around the dining table where Hector had laid out a spread of southwestern hospitality: fresh tortillas, local honey, homemade empanadas, and his famous prickly pear lemonade. The ranch hand himself had discreetly withdrawn to the barn, sensing the official nature of the gathering. Dr. Whelan accepted a glass of lemonade, her gaze taking in the transformed interior of the ranch house. Sophie's drawings of Ember and his herd prominently displayed alongside maps of the sanctuary and the colonel's military commendations. "You've created something remarkable here, Colonel," she observed. "When the Painted Canyon Wild Horse Sanctuary proposal first crossed my desk, I was skeptical. We've had private-public partnerships before, but none centered around a single Mustang herd with such unusual characteristics." Harper nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Ember's herd is certainly unique in my experience." "That's putting it mildly," Dr. Blackwood interjected with a smile. 6 months of observation has documented behaviors that challenge everything we thought we knew about feral horse cognition and social structure." Dr. Whelan set down her glass. "Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. The Interior Department is re-evaluating its approach to wild horse management across the West. The current system of roundups and holding facilities is costly, controversial, and increasingly unsustainable. Not to mention cruel," Sophie added quietly. The Undersecretary's gaze shifted to the child, not dismissive but genuinely considering. "Many would agree with you, young lady. Which is why what's happening here at Painted Canyon is of such interest to us. Dr. Blackwood tells me the sanctuary is effectively self-regulating. It is, Dr. Blackwood confirmed. Ember's herd maintains stable population numbers without our intervention. They appear to practice a form of natural family planning we don't fully understand yet, and their territorial behavior effectively prevents other herds from overgrazing the designated lands. Most remarkable, Dr. Whelan continued, is the absence of conflict with surrounding ranches. No reports of damaged fences, no competition for water resources, no straying onto private grazing lands. It's as if they understand the boundaries we've established, Harper finished for her. Yes, that's been our experience from the beginning. Sophie, who had been following the conversation closely, spoke up. Ember knows which lands are protected for them. I showed him on our rides. Every adult at the table turned toward her with varying expressions of surprise. Dr. Blackwood recovered first. Rides? Sophie, are you saying Ember has allowed you to ride him? The girl nodded matter-of-factly. Only 3 times, and just around the property boundaries. He wanted to understand where his family would be safe. The colonel struggled to maintain his composure. When did this happen, Sophie? Last month, when Dr. Eleanor was away at her conference, Sophie admitted. I didn't tell anyone because I knew you'd worry. But Ember was very careful with me. He's never been ridden before, but he let me sit on his back while we walked the sea. Fence line. Seeing the adult's stunned expressions, she added defensively, I wore my helmet. Dr. Whelan's professional demeanor cracked into unexpected laughter. Young lady, I believe you've just added another extraordinary chapter to an already remarkable story. She turned to Dr. Blackwood. A truly wild mustang stallion, voluntarily accepting a rider, without training or restraint. Unprecedented, Dr. Blackwood agreed, visibly struggling between scientific amazement and retroactive concern for Sophie's safety. Though I wish I'd been present to document it. I took pictures, Sophie offered, sliding from her chair to retrieve her tablet from a nearby shelf. She returned and passed the device to Dr. Blackwood, who gasped audibly at the images. There on the screen was undeniable evidence. Sophie seated bareback on Ember's copper coat, the stallion's ears pricked forward, attentively as they moved along the sanctuary boundary. The girl's face shone with quiet joy, one hand resting lightly on the flowing mane, the other gesturing toward the horizon as if explaining something important to her mount. Extraordinary, Dr. Whelan murmured as the tablet was passed to her. And you believe you were showing him the sanctuary boundaries? Sophie nodded solemnly. He needed to understand where his family would be protected and where they shouldn't go. Maps don't make sense to horses, but seeing the fences and markers helped him understand. The colonel, having recovered from his initial shock, studied his granddaughter with a mixture of concern and pride. The bond between Sophie and Ember had deepened over the months since their dramatic first encounter, evolving into something that defied conventional understanding of human-animal relationships. He had witnessed their silent communications, observed how the mustang seemed to anticipate the child's needs and moods. Yet this newest revelation, that Sophie had actually ridden the wild stallion, suggested a level of trust that transcended even his broadest expectations. I should be upset about this, he said finally. Riding a wild mustang without supervision or safety measures beyond a helmet. But you're not, Sophie finished confidently, because you know Ember would never hurt me. Harper sighed, acknowledging the truth in her words. Nevertheless, in the future, please inform an adult before undertaking such adventures. Dr. Whelan cleared her throat, returning the conversation to official matters. Colonel Harper, what your granddaughter has accomplished here, her connection with this remarkable animal, offers potentially groundbreaking insights for wildlife management. The Interior Department would like to establish Painted Canyon as a pilot program for a new approach to mustang conservation. What exactly would that entail? Harper asked, military caution evident in his tone. Expanded protected territory for one, Dr. Whelan replied. The current 3,000 acres is adequate for Ember's herd, but we're prepared to designate up to 15,000 additional acres of adjacent BLM land for sanctuary purposes. We would also provide funding for research facilities, educational, programs, and additional staff. And in return, the colonel pressed, decades of government service having taught him that official generosity rarely came without expectations. Dr. Whelan smiled, apparently appreciating his directness. In return, we'd like to establish Painted Canyon as a living laboratory for studying alternative approaches to wild horse management. Researchers would have controlled access to observe the herd, document their behaviors, and potentially apply those insights to other mustang populations across the West. Would they try to capture Ember and his family? Sophie asked, the protective edge in her voice unmistakable. Absolutely not, Dr. Whelan assured her firmly. The entire premise of the program is non-intervention observation. What makes Ember's herd so valuable is precisely that they are wild but cooperative. Trying to capture or control them would destroy everything that makes them unique. The colonel considered the proposal, automatically assessing potential risks and benefits with the strategic mind that had served him through decades of military service. The sanctuary would remain under Double H stewardship? With expanded resources and support, yes, Dr. Whelan confirmed. Your unique position as both a respected former military officer and the grandfather of a child with this extraordinary connection to the herd makes you ideally suited to manage the pilot program. I'd need to review the specific terms, Harper said thoughtfully, particularly regarding visitor access and research protocols. Of course, I've brought preliminary documentation for your consideration. Dr. Whelan retrieved a folder from her briefcase. Take whatever time you need to review it. We're prepared to be quite flexible on the details, given the unique circumstances. As the adults discussed logistical considerations, Sophie quietly slipped outside onto the porch. The colonel, attuned to his granddaughter's movements, excused himself momentarily to check on her. He found Sophie standing at the porch railing, gazing toward the eastern ridge where Ember's herd often appeared. "Everything all right, kiddo?" he asked, joining her. "I was just thinking about Mom and Dad," she replied, her voice soft but not sad. "They would have liked this place, especially the mustangs." Harper placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, surprised, as always, by the child's capacity to reference her loss without being consumed by it. "I think you're right. Your mother always loved horses. That's why they were flying that day," Sophie continued, revealing a detail she had never before shared. Mom had found out about a wild horse sanctuary in Colorado that let visitors observe the herds. It was going to be my birthday surprise. She turned to face her grandfather, eyes clear and direct. "I think that's why Ember found me. Because even though Mom and Dad couldn't take me to see the wild horses, they made sure the wild horses found me instead." The colonel felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Sophie's perspective, finding meaning and connection in tragedy rather than just loss, humbled him. "That's a beautiful thought," he managed finally. "So I think we should say yes to Dr. Whelan's program," Sophie concluded with the straightforward practicality that often followed her moments of profound insight. Ember and his family deserve the extra land, and maybe other wild horses can be helped too. Harper nodded, accepting the wisdom of her assessment. "I believe you're right, though we'll still review the details carefully." When they returned inside, the Colonel found Dr. Whelan and Dr. Blackwood at the window, watching something with evident fascination. "They're here," Dr. Blackwood said quietly, gesturing toward the eastern pasture. Beyond the fence line, Ember's herd had appeared, nearly 30 mustangs now, including this spring's new foals. They moved with their characteristic grace across the landscape, the copper stallion in the lead, his posture alert but not tense. As they watched, the herd approached closer to the ranch house than they typically ventured during daylight hours. "Is this normal behavior?" Dr. Whelan asked, professional curiosity evident in her voice. Dr. Blackwood shook her head. "They usually maintain more distance unless Sophie is alone. This close approach with visitors present is unprecedented." Sophie moved to the door. "They know something important is happening. Ember can feel it." Before any of the adults could respond, she was out the door and moving across the yard toward the pasture fence. The Colonel followed, gesturing for the others to maintain a respectful distance. At the fence line, Sophie stopped, waiting as Ember approached. The magnificent stallion moved with deliberate dignity, separating from his herd to stand directly before the child. Behind him, the other mustangs arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, the yearlings and 2-year-olds fidgeting with youthful energy, while the mares kept watchful eyes on their new foals. "Hello, Ember," Sophie said softly. "These people want to protect more land for you and your family. Is that okay?" The stallion's ears flicked forward, his intelligent eyes seeming to assess the humans gathered at a distance. He lowered his head, slightly nostrils flaring as he took in Sophie's scent. Then, to the astonishment of the observers, he turned his gaze directly toward Dr. Whelan and nickered softly, a sound rarely directed at humans by wild mustangs. "I believe that's as close to official approval as we're likely to get," the Colonel observed, unable to suppress a smile at the Undersecretary's expression of wonder. "I've been working with wild horses for 30 years, Dr. Whelan said quietly, "and I've never witnessed anything like this. Your granddaughter has a gift, Colonel Harper, a remarkable gift. Not just mine," Sophie corrected, still focused on Ember. "Ember chose to trust humans again, even after people tried to hurt him when he was young. That was his gift to us." As if understanding her words, the copper stallion gently pressed his muzzle against Sophie's outstretched palm, the equine gesture of acceptance and trust that had once seemed impossible for a truly wild mustang. Then, with a soft snort and toss of his flowing mane, he turned and led his herd back toward the eastern hills, disappearing into the landscape they had claimed as their own for generations before humans had drawn boundaries across the desert. The Painted Canyon Wild Horse Sanctuary was formally expanded and designated as a federal pilot program 3 months later. The small ceremony at the Double H Ranch drew modest media attention, though the Colonel had insisted on limiting press access to protect both the mustangs and Sophie's privacy. Dr. Whelan represented the Department of the Interior, presenting the official designation with appropriate governmental formality. This partnership represents a new approach to wild horse management, she announced to the small gathering of local officials, neighboring ranchers, and university researchers. One based on understanding and cooperation rather than control and constraint. We have much to learn from Colonel Harper, his granddaughter Sophie, and most importantly from Ember and his remarkable herd. As the crowd applauded politely, Sophie leaned toward her grandfather, whispering, "Ember's watching from the ridge." The colonel glanced toward the eastern boundary, where indeed the copper stallion stood silhouetted against the blue New Mexico sky. Though too distant for most to notice, Harper had learned to spot that distinctive shape over the past months. The proud head, the alert posture, the unmistakable presence that somehow transcended ordinary animal awareness. "Of course, he is," Harper murmured back. "It's his sanctuary being recognized after all." After the ceremony concluded and the visitors departed, Sophie and the colonel walked the boundary of the newly expanded sanctuary. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, transforming the rugged terrain into a tapestry of gold. In deep purple, they moved in comfortable silence, each lost in private reflections on the journey that had brought them here. "Grandpa," Sophie said finally, pausing to examine a wildflower growing improbably from a crack in a sun-baked rock, "do you think there are other animals like Ember? Ones that understand more than people think they do?" The colonel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I imagine there are, though perhaps not all animals have the capacity Ember seems to possess. Or perhaps humans haven't learned to recognize their intelligence." Sophie nodded, satisfied with his answer. "I'm going to be a scientist like Dr. Eleanor when I grow up, but not just any scientist, one who helps people understand animals better, so we can protect them and learn from them at the same time." "That sounds like a fine ambition," Harper approved, seeing in his granddaughter's determined expression echoes of her mother's passion and her father's intellect. As they turned back toward the ranch house, a soft, nickering sound drew their attention. Ember stood 50 yards away, having approached silently while they talked. The copper stallion regarded them with that unfathomable gaze that suggested awareness beyond instinct, an intelligence that had chosen to bridge the ancient divide between human and horse. "He's saying goodbye for now," Sophie translated confidently. "He's taking the herd to the high canyon for the summer. There's better grazing there with the new land protected." The colonel didn't question how she knew this, having long since accepted that the connection between his granddaughter and the wild mustang operated according to rules that transcended conventional understanding. "Safe travels, old friend," he said simply, offering the stallion a respectful nod. Ember tossed his head once, then turned and cantered away, copper coat ablaze in the setting sun. Wild and free, yet bound by invisible threads of loyalty to the humans who had become, against all odds, allies in preserving the ancient spirit of the American West. As they walked back to the ranch house, Sophie slipped her hand into her grandfather's, a gesture that had become less frequent as she grew more independent. "We did good, didn't we, Grandpa? Helping Ember and his family?" "We did, kiddo," the colonel agreed, squeezing her small hand gently, "but I suspect they've helped us even more." Above them, the vast New Mexico sky deepened toward evening, stars beginning to emerge one by one in the darkening canopy. On the distant ridge, briefly silhouetted against the last golden light of day, the copper stallion stood watching, guardian spirit, wild protector, bridge between worlds that modern humans had forgotten could connect. Then he was gone, disappearing into the wilderness that had claimed him, though the bond he had forged would remain, a reminder that in this harsh, beautiful landscape, unexpected guardians might appear when needed most, and that some connections transcended the boundaries. Humans so carefully constructed between themselves and the wild world beyond.